again, everyone, good morning. Welcome to the 31st Annual Journalists and Editors Workshop. My name is Frank Mora. I'm the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and proud to be partnering with the School of Journalism and Mass Communications here at FIU to put this workshop together. Let me say a couple of housekeeping admin issues before we start. First, we have a simultaneous translation, so please, if you need, we have the headphones in the back, and we'll be doing this throughout today's session. The next housekeeping is if you want access to our Wi-Fi connection, we have the password and name that you need, and that information, this little piece of paper, is available outside. So feel free to pass by and use this service. And finally, and probably most importantly, the restrooms are down the hall, all the way down the hall here on your left side. Well, again, thank you all for being here. This is, as I mentioned, the 31st, right? Over 3 decades of doing this workshop that has been of great value, I think, not only to our students, but to young professionals in journalism. And it offers an opportunity for our other journalists, senior journalists, to come and share their thoughts about some of the opportunities, the challenges, the issues confronting journalism, the media in the region. We started partnering with the Miami Herald many years ago, and it's gone through several variations. And here in the last few years, we've been, as I mentioned, been a pleasure partnering with the FIU School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and specifically with Dean Raul Rice, who I will introduce. And this is my first year as director of LAC doing this program, and I'm just delighted with what we've got to offer today, and to have and see so many of you here today. Hope to see you all throughout the course of the day. My commitment to you and to the university is to keep doing this important workshop, to keep ramping it and asking for your advice, thoughts about potential panelists, issues that we need or should be covering. This is going to be, and I see this very much as workshop should be, a very dynamic process in which we're all learning from each other on these issues. This year's issue is, as you can see from the program, how free are the media in the Americas today? It's one that is a pressing issue for journalists, editors, and others in the Americas. Raul will talk a little bit more about that, but on behalf of the Latin American Caribbean Center, again, I want to thank you for being here, and you all should have received what we're calling a feedback form. So we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts about the workshop, and some ideas as to, as I mentioned, we can improve upon. Now let me introduce my partner in crime in this effort, and it's been really a pleasure working with him over the last 7 to 8 months on this particular workshop, and I look forward to continue working with him. Is the Dean of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Raul Rice, who is, in addition to being Dean, a professor at the school. The Dean, I think, exemplifies what we all, I think, value, and that is that bridge, that practitioner, and that scholar coming together and really being able to offer our programs and our students those different perspectives from someone who's been many years as a journalist, and now many years also as a scholar. A veteran of journalists and academia, Dean Rice has worked for more than 8 years as a newspaper TV and magazine editor and reporter at several Brazilian news organizations. In the US, more recently, he's worked as a copy editor, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, as a fellow, before joining California State University system in 1997, and later the Long Beach campus in 2000 to 2011. At Cal State Long Beach, Dean Rice has taught news writing, research methods, global news media, media ethics, mass communication theory, and digital journalism. He has also taught a number of courses in Brazil, having taken students and other programs to Brazil, where he's focused on science and environmental journalism, including, and this one I want to join him on, a 2-week trip to the Amazon forest. So I look forward to that. He is published extensively in academic journals as well as in books, and we at FIU are just delighted to have him here at the university, and I have been, as I said, been a pleasure working with him on this project, and look forward to working with him in other projects. So please help me welcome Dean Raul Rice.
Good morning, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you all here at the Biscayne Bay campus of FIU. It's a beautiful day and it's a beautiful campus. I invite you to explore the campus a little bit. Thank you, Frank, for the introduction and also for working with us on this project. I'm the dean of the school, and the school is one of the 3 schools on this campus at FIU. So we feel a little responsible for this campus, and we want to make sure that you have a proper welcome and you get a chance of exploring a little bit what we have to offer here at the Biscayne Bay campus of FIU. But so the topic that we have today, as Frank mentioned, is how free are the media in the Americas today? Before we get to that, I wanted to thank LAC, the Latin American Caribbean Center, and Frank Mora, and specifically Sally Zamudio, for helping us put together, for co-organizing, co-sponsoring this event with us, and also the law firm of Hunton and Williams for co-sponsoring, and the University of Miami for co-sponsoring this event. It's a pleasure, as always, to work with all of you to make this happen. But today we'll be talking about freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of the media in the Americas. And I wanted to point out that in 2013, Ecuador and Paraguay, only 2 countries that among the countries that were downgraded from partially free to not free on the Freedom House list that ranks how free the media are in each country. By being downgraded to not free, Ecuador and Paraguay joined a growing list of Latin American countries that also includes Honduras, Mexico, Venezuela, and Cuba, all characterized as not free on this year's and past year's lists. In the case of Ecuador, the country was dropped from the partially free list because of state interference and a hostile environment for the press. This is a quote from the Freedom House. The justification could probably be applied to other Latin American Caribbean countries with the same ranking. Reporters Without Borders, which is a different NGO that also issues its own press freedom index, ranks Argentina 54th and Brazil, my country, an embarrassing 108th on its list of most to least press-free countries. Brazil dropped 9 places on the ranking from 2012 to 2013, in part because 5 journalists were assassinated in Brazil in 2013 alone. In the case of Argentina, which dropped 7 places on the list, the downgrading was justified by the growing tension between the government, I guess that's an understatement, growing tension between the government and privately owned media, culminating with the adoption of new media laws that some analysts say were designed to curb, if not silence, opposition voices. So with LAC publishes every year Hemisphere magazine. It's an annual magazine. This is this 2013 issue of Hemisphere magazine. And this 2014, I was lucky enough that they invited me to guest edit an issue of the magazine that will be centered around press freedom in the Americas, including the US. We are not excluding the US from this discussion about freedom in the Americas that we are looking at. So the magazine will be going to press next week, and we are hoping that you all get a chance of seeing the magazine. And by participating in this workshop today, you're also getting a preview of some of the issues that the magazine will be covering. So we enjoy you to engage in this discussion about press freedom. When we talk about big countries like Brazil and Argentina going down on the list so much from year to year, it's more than embarrassing. Also, it's a call to action. And I think as people who are interested, either coming from Latin America or interested in Latin American media issues, we should pay attention to those. One of those people is going to be our keynote speaker this morning, and I have the pleasure of introducing you to Carlos Lauria, who is the Senior Program Coordinator, Chief Strategist, and Spokesperson on America's Press Freedom Issues at the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. CPJ's mission is to promote press freedom worldwide and defend the rights of journalists to report the news without fear of reprisal and take action whenever journalists are attacked, imprisoned, killed, kidnapped, threatened, censored, or harassed. Carlos monitors and documents press freedom violations in Latin America and has led missions to Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Haiti, Brazil, El Salvador, and Argentina. That's a lot of countries. Lauria began his journalistic career in Buenos Aires in 1986, and in 1994 was named U.S. Bureau Chief Correspondent for Editorial Perfil, Argentina's largest magazine publisher. He serves on the board of the Maria Morse Cabot Award for Excellence in Latin American Journalism, which is sponsored by Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. And he's a graduate of Universidad Católica de Argentina. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Carlos Lauria.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. It is an honor to speak to you today about important issues not only for basic human rights, but also for the stability of the democracy in the Americas. I will focus my presentation today on the threats that journalists face while doing their jobs and its impact on human rights, including freedom of expression and access to information. And I hope that after my presentation and the discussion, you'll be able to reach your own conclusions about how free are the media in the Americas today. In different countries across the hemisphere, broad aspects of public discourse are limited by the threat of physical violence, government censorship, restrictive laws, and financial pressures. The lack of vigorous debates on issues of public interest, which is the cornerstone of modern democracies, is creating political instability, reducing government accountability, and compromising economic development. With the exception of Cuba, democracy in the Americas has become well established. While many countries in the region have great investigative journalism, editorial independence, and critical coverage, reporters and media outlets are both exposed to violence and government repression. Violence and official legal harassment are, in fact, the main emerging trends that illustrate the major challenges facing the press in the Americas, according to research from the Committee to Protect Journalists. For more than 2 decades, transnational criminal organizations have extended their sway and spread a wave of deadly violence across Latin America. Political turmoil and weakened institutions have been the consequences of their illegal behavior. In this context, coverage of crime, corruption, human rights abuses, and other sensitive issues made journalism a high-risk profession. Scores of journalists have been killed, disappeared, and brutally attacked in the last 2 decades. And this happens with total impunity, as dysfunctional and overloaded judicial systems have been incapable and in many instances unwilling to bring those responsible for these crimes to justice. With over 50 journalists killed or disappeared on the last 7 years, Mexico is clearly the deadliest country for the press in the Americas and one of the most dangerous in the world. Media outlets have seen their offices bombed or fired upon and their websites hacked. Violence linked to organized crime and corruption have devastated the news media and stripped citizens of their fundamental rights to freedom of expression and access to information. Terror and censorship have destroyed the ability of the press to report the news while placing Mexico's future as a democracy at risk. A climate of widespread impunity exacerbates the problem. Journalists are attacked while reporting on complicity between criminal and officials, and they have been targeted while pursuing crime or corruption stories. Crimes are almost completely unsolved. Impunity is the norm. This is not only the product of negligence and incompetence, but of pervasive corruption among law enforcement. In many occasions, the lines between political and criminal groups are unclear, raising the risk for reporters. Local journalists pay the highest price, and this is also a global trend. Nearly 9 out of 10 journalists killed worldwide are reporters that are working on issues in their own community, according to CPJ research. On May 3rd last year, coinciding with World Press Freedom Day, laws that implemented a constitutional amendment giving federal authorities in Mexico broader jurisdiction to prosecute crimes against freedom of expression were signed by President Enrique Peña Nieto. This was a step forward in the fight against impunity. The legislation establishes accountability at senior levels of the national government, evading the more corrupt and less effective state law enforcement officials. The administration of Enrique Peña Nieto, though, must now show full political will to break this terrible cycle of impunity that is affecting Mexico's democracy. Criminal networks and rampant impunity have also forced the press into silence in some Central American countries, but nowhere more so than in Honduras. With an average of 80 murders per 100,000 inhabitants, the highest homicide rate in the world, according to United Nations. A climate of violence and widespread impunity has made this country one of the most dangerous in the region. Out-of-control gang violence, the presence of powerful Mexican drug cartels, and deep societal polarization following the 2009 coup that ousted former President Manuel Zelaya are all factors that have made the work of reporters even more dangerous. A total of 16 journalists have been killed in Honduras since 2009, at least 3 in direct reprisal for the work, according to CPJ. Pervasive impunity, in addition to negligent and incompetent investigating work, often makes it difficult to determine motives in murder cases. Honduras authorities' approach toward the killings of journalists has aggravated the problem even more. Officials have many times played down the threat often arguing that the murders are not related to the work of journalists. But so far, they have not presented concrete evidence to make their case. The Dean was talking about Brazil. Investigative journalism is thriving in Brazil, but a spike in lethal violence has made this country one of the most dangerous for journalists in the world, according to CPJ research. The numbers speak for themselves. At least 17 journalists killed since President Dilma Rousseff took office in 2011, at least 12 of them in direct retaliation for the journalism. 9 out of 10 journalists killed in the past 2 years, for example, had reported on official corruption or crime, and all but one worked in provincial areas. Reporters are more vulnerable to attack in provincial areas where law enforcement is weak. But journalists who work in urban centers, large urban centers, are not immune to threats and violence. Those who cover organized crime, official corruption, and drug trafficking have faced serious risks and, in certain cases, have been forced into hiding and exile. While the level of violence is unacceptably high, it is important to emphasize and to highlight that Brazil has made significant progress in the fight against impunity. In 2013, for example, convictions were made against the killers of journalists in 3 different cases. Even as deadly violence has drastically declined in the last decade, Colombia continues to rank among the most murderous countries for journalists worldwide, with 44 journalists killed in reprisal for their work since 1992. While authorities have made strides in combating impunity in cases of murdered journalists, improvements in the overall security have generally outpaced judicial gains. While the number of killings have decreased, threats have been on the rise. Besides the threat of physical violence, the following most pressing issue for the regional media.
El siguiente importante asunto es una serie de leyes restrictivas
Showing disdain for the institutions of democracy. Several governments in the region are seeking to stifle dissent and control the flow of information. They describe journalists as the unelected opposition, and these governments have become increasingly intolerant to media criticism. Venezuela, no question about it, provides the starkest example of the lack of tolerance to different views and opinions. For more than a month now, journalists covering street protests in Venezuela and around the country have been under fire. CPJ has documented several cases of arbitrary detention, violence, harassment, and intimidation by Venezuelan law enforcement. The pressure on Venezuela's private media has intensified in recent months. The government of President Maduro has used a number of tactics, including limiting access to newsprint, ordering internet service providers to block websites that provide the black market exchange rate, and suppressing reports of economic turmoil to muzzle critical voices. But this situation does not come as a surprise. In the past 15 years, Venezuela has used different laws, regulatory measures, and judicial decisions to progressively break down the private press. With majority in the National Assembly and control over the judiciary and government regulators, authorities have closed down dozens of broadcasters, censored critical coverage, sued reporters for defamation, excluded those deemed unfriendly from official events, and intimidated critical journalists. At the same time, the Venezuelan government has built an unprecedented state media empire that it is used to harass critics and obscure issues like crime, corruption, and the economic crisis. During the past decade, Venezuela has invested heavily to build a large state press conglomerate to further the government's political agenda. While the state largely broadcasts propaganda at the expense of plural viewpoints, it is also used as a platform to launch attacks and smear critical journalists. But Venezuela has also served as a model in the region for leaders who are trying to weaken the press, repress dissent, and exert control over information. Perhaps none has learned the lesson better than Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, whose policies have transformed the country into one of the hemisphere's most restrictive nations for the press. Ecuador has made use of archaic criminal defamation laws to silence critical journalists. A former op-ed editor and 3 executives with the largest circulation daily in Universo were sentenced to 3 years in prison and 40 million in fines for allegedly defaming the president in an opinion column. President Correa also filed a $10 million civil defamation suit against investigative journalists Juan Carlos Calderón and Cristian Zurita, authors of a book called Gran Hermano, or The Big Brother on Official Corruptions. Both journalists were ordered to pay $1 million each in damages to Correa. The president later pardoned the journalists and the executives in both cases, but he said he will not forgive. The communications law approved in June 2017 by the Ecuadorian National Assembly represents a severe blow to freedom of expression. It's one of the most restrictive laws, press laws, promulgated in the hemisphere in the last decade. The law establishes regulation of editorial content and gives authorities the power to impose arbitrary sanctions and censor the press. Restrictive provisions and a vague language run counter to constitutional guarantees and international standards of freedom of expression. The law not only undermines journalists' ability to report critically, but threatens the right of journalists to be informed about sensitive issues. It is filled with ambiguous language demanding that journalists provide accurate and balanced information or face civil or criminal penalties. Article 26, for example, prohibits media lynching, that it is defined as the dissemination of concerted and reiterative information with the purpose of undermining the prestige of a person or legal entity. Media outlets find violating this provision could be ordered to issue public apologies and would be subject to criminal and civil sanctions that are not specified in the legislation. The recent sanction against the cartoonist of the Daily Universo is a clear example of how this law is being applied to stifle dissent in Ecuador. In the last few years, Cuba has projected an image of a nation opening up economically, but the government of President Raúl Castro has taken no important actions to promote freedom of expression and access to information. The authorities' decision to eliminate the exit visa regulation that had long restricted Cuban travel is a positive step that has allowed government critics to travel abroad. But harassment and intimidation of independent journalists and political dissidents have remained a constant. Though the government has almost abandoned its policy of long-term detentions, short-term arrests and harassment, especially surrounding widely covered events, is a common practice. Internet penetration remains low, with existing public connections slow and expensive. The installation of a fiber optic cable financed by Venezuela was completed, but the analysts say internet access is still elusive for most Cubans. The general population goes online at hotels or government-controlled internet cafe by means of expensive voucher cards. Define economic and legal aspects. A vibrant community of independent bloggers that detail everyday life and offer criticism of the Cuban government. The blogs are hosted outside the country and are largely blocked in Cuba. And finally, being in Miami today, I must also mention the developments that have seriously worsened the climate for press freedom in the United States. a CPJ 2003 report written by Leonard Downey Jr. from former executive editor of the Washington Post, and Sarah Rafsky, America's Program researcher, shows that freedom of expression has dramatically deteriorated in the United States. Action taken by the United States Department of Justice in seizing journalists' phone records and emails, the aggressive prosecution of whistleblowers who leak classified information to the press, lack of transparency and access to information, a massive surveillance of communications send an explicit, chilling message to journalists and their sources, particularly on issues of national security that are of vital importance to the public. At the same time, and just as troubling, actions in the United States set a terrible example for the rest of the world, where governments routinely justify intervention in the media by citing national security. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to have free time. Thank you very much, Carlos. I think we have some time for questions. So we have a mic up here in front. So if you like, please come up, identify yourself, and ask the questions. As you're perhaps thinking about what to ask, let me be the first one to ask Carlos the question that kind of begs a little bit your remarks, and that is the why. Why have we seen sort of, if you could briefly tell us, what explains the seemingly deterioration in press freedom? What has happened over the last 10 years that not only that governments have taken these steps, these legal steps to restrict, but that there seems to be tolerance in the public for these kinds of restrictions?
Well, I think that part of the reason about the lack of tolerance by leaders, most of them democratically elected leaders in the Americas, has to do with the fact that not long ago, many of these countries were ruled by military regimes. So, most of these people, some of them in the case of Venezuela, Chavez was a lieutenant colonel who gave attempted to coup d'etat. They were emerged in this. They were inside this atmosphere, very restrictive atmosphere, and this component, right? This authoritarianism component is, in some ways, maybe masked in most of these societies, and that may be part of the reason that explains, the lack of tolerance of many of these leaders. It's not a question. I don't think it's a question of ideology. It's not a question of right or left. I remember, when President Uribe was in power in Colombia, his reactions towards press criticism were similar to Chavez's reactions to press criticism. In terms of vilifying those who express different points of view. I think that the situation in Venezuela has gone way further, and the weakening of the institutions there has been really profound, and the spaces for critical journalism have been reduced dramatically, and this is clearly affecting not only the right of people, including journalists, to exercise freedom of expression and to access very important information, but the ability of policymakers to make effective public policy, right? And and this is happening also not only in countries where there's government repression. I think that this is also happening in places where violence is widespread. Mexico, for example, right? There are areas in Mexico where there's a total information vacuum, where organized crime exerts total control, and citizens are deprived of the main issues that affect the daily lives. The daily shootouts where dozens of people are killed are not being reported. They are not being reported in some of these areas. So it's a challenge not only for people, but also for policymakers.
Good, thank you. Anybody wants to come up to the mic? Please, come ahead.
My name is Carlos Navarro. I'm from the Latin American Iberian Institute at University of New Mexico. The question I have is related to the ownership of the media, and and this is a charge that I've heard about Latin America, but it happens in the United States. How independent are the journalists from the media conglomerates that own the media? The charge that I've heard is that they often tend to parrot the point of view of the pro-business point of view of the conglomerates as opposed to covering the interests of the population.
Right, thank you.
Well, I think that concentration of media ownership, it's as you said, it's something that goes from the U.S. to South America, and the excessive concentration of media ownership in just a few hands, I think it affects the press freedom climate because it lessens choice for consumers, right? It's a less plural and diverse environment. But I will say that many of these governments in Latin America, and particularly the Venezuelan government, and you can see also that today in Ecuador and in Argentina too, are using that as a pretext to target critical journalists. And while we recognize that the lack of anti-monopolic laws has created this possibility where there's in countries where there are these big powerful media conglomerates, at the same time these governments are using that as a pretext to not only to target critical journalists, but in Venezuela to shut down broadcasters, and it has become a real problem.
I'm Professor Vigan from the School of Journalism. And going back to the question of why, who Ferran Mora already said, the why, but in the States, why would it be, do you think, you mentioned a little bit this concept of contagious, as how Ecuador has kind of followed Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And do you think the climate of negative scene of repression or of more overlook on the press right now in the U.S. somehow is reflective of the atmosphere in Latin America? Can you see any connection of what is happening here in the States, the regression that we are having with what is happening in the United States, in Latin America?
Yeah, no, I think there are different issues. I think that the regression in the U.S. is not only in this administration, has clearly been seen in this administration for the prosecution of whistleblowers and the revelations about massive surveillance on communications. But lack of access and transparency has been an issue since the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So I think they're not related. It's not a reflection. What happened in Latin America to what's going on in the United States. I think there are different issues.
Please come forward.
Pedro Gonzalez, I'm the president of the Florida Association of Hispanic Journalists. We have a situation with the concentration in the media here. The Hispanic newspapers are disappearing in the U.S., the concentration in a few companies that are not only affecting the publication, and then we have a huge situation in this country with a cultural genocide. A language is disappearing. Our children can't read and express themselves in Spanish anymore. We only have a couple of newspapers in Spanish, Diario de las Américas, El Nuevo Día in Puerto Rico, and the other ones have executives like El Nuevo Herald in different places that maybe they are Gonzalez or Perez, but their editors and journalists can't read in Spanish. How do you consider that that is affecting not only the journalists, but it's also affecting our community?
Well, I think, you make a point, less choice for Spanish readers. I think it's clearly affecting. I mean, I think this is an issue that has more to do with, the transformation of the media landscape and, new technologies and the internet and the mix between the explosion of the new technologies and the economic crisis, and the fact that, there are less, people are reading more online than reading, print newspapers. So, we are not looking at that issue as one of the problems that really affecting the press freedom landscape.
Well, I want to again thank Carlos for joining us and for your presentation and for your day here with us, and look forward to continuing the conversations on the margins of the workshop. I'd like to invite now the plenary session panel to join us here for the next session. So could Ricardo Trotti and his distinguished group come up for the next session?